History did not expect her to rule. She was not born into power. She was not born Russian. She was not meant to become an empress. Yet she would rise to rule one of the largest empires the world had ever known. Catherine the Great, a name carved into history with authority, intelligence, and contradiction. Born as a minor German princess, she arrived in Russia as a teenager, alone in a foreign court where power was fragile, loyalty was dangerous, and failure often meant death. She learned quickly that survival in Russia required more than obedience. It required patience. It required strategy. And above all, it required understanding power, how it was gained, how it was kept, and how it was taken. Through a loveless marriage, political intrigue, and constant danger, Catherine transformed herself from an overlooked outsider into the most powerful woman in Europe. She ruled as an absolute monarch while embracing the ideas of the Enlightenment. She expanded Russia's borders while speaking the language of reason and reform. She corresponded with philosophers while ruling over millions of serfs. This is not simply the story of a queen. It is the story of ambition, intellect, and survival in a world built to exclude women from power. This is the story of how Catherine became great. Catherine the Great did not begin her life surrounded by power, wealth, or destiny. She was born on May 2, 1729, in the small Prussian city of Stettin, as Sophie Friederike Auguste von Anhalt-Zerbst, a name far too long for a girl whose future, at the time, seemed painfully small. Her family belonged to the lower ranks of German nobility. They were respectable but poor, well-connected but powerless. Sophie's father was a minor military officer. Her mother, ambitious and socially restless, dreamed of advancement far beyond what their modest circumstances allowed. This tension between limitation and aspiration would shape Sophie's earliest understanding of the world. From a young age, Sophie learned a harsh truth. Birth could open doors, but it could just as easily close them. Her childhood was strict, disciplined, and emotionally cold. Affection was rare, praise even rarer. Her mother pushed her relentlessly, believing that marriage, not talent, was the only path to security for a woman of their rank. But Sophie was not passive. She was intelligent, observant, and unusually self-controlled. She read voraciously, absorbed ideas quickly, and developed an early habit of watching people carefully, learning their weaknesses, their ambitions, their fears. These were not the traits of a typical 18th century princess. They were the traits of a survivor. By her early teens, Sophie had already learned to hide her emotions, adapt her behavior, and endure discomfort without complaint. She understood that obedience was expected, but silence was power. It was this quiet resilience that would soon place her at the center of one of Europe's most dangerous courts. In the 1740s, Russia was ruled by Empress Elizabeth, daughter of Peter the Great. Elizabeth had no children and no clear successor. The Russian throne, as always, was unstable. To secure the dynasty, Elizabeth searched Europe for a suitable bride for her nephew and heir, Grand Duke Peter of Holstein-Gottorp. Sophie, young Protestant, politically insignificant, was a perfect candidate. She posed no threat, she had no powerful allies, and she could be molded. In 1744, Sophie and her mother received an invitation that would change everything, an official summons to the Russian court. For Sophie, it was not a promise, it was a test. At just 14 years old, she left her homeland and traveled east into a world that was colder, harsher, and infinitely more dangerous than anything she had known. Russia was vast, alien, ruthless, and it did not welcome outsiders. From the moment she arrived, Sophie understood something essential. To survive in Russia, she would have to become Russian, not in appearance, but in spirit. She threw herself into learning the Russian language, practicing tirelessly despite illness and exhaustion. She studied Orthodox Christianity, knowing full well that conversion was not optional, it was survival. When Sophie fell seriously ill with pneumonia, doctors feared for her life. But even from her sickbed, she insisted on continuing her studies. She wanted the court to see her commitment. She wanted the empress to see her devotion. And it worked. In 1745, Sophie formally converted to Orthodoxy and took a new name, Katerina Alexeyevna. The transformation was complete. The German girl had vanished. A Russian Grand Duchess had been born. But the price of this transformation would soon become painfully clear. Catherine's marriage to Peter was a disaster from the beginning. Peter was immature, unstable, and deeply unpopular at court. He idolized Prussia, despised Russian customs, and showed little interest in governance or in his wife. He humiliated Catherine publicly, ignored her privately, and treated marriage as a performance rather than a bond. For Catherine, this was not a romantic disappointment. It was a political nightmare. In the Russian court, a wife who failed to produce an heir or loyalty was disposable. Catherine lived under constant scrutiny. Her behavior, friendships, and even thoughts were watched. One mistake could mean exile, or worse. So she adapted. She remained outwardly obedient, inwardly observant. She listened more than she spoke. She learned who held influence and who merely pretended to. While Peter isolated himself, Catherine built relationships. Slowly, carefully, strategically. Denied affection, Catherine turned to ideas. She read philosophy, history, political theory, especially the works of Enlightenment thinkers. She absorbed concepts of governance, law, and reason, not as abstract ideals, but as tools. She understood something few around her did. Ideas were power, and knowledge could be weaponized. Catherine began to imagine a future beyond survival, a future in which she did not merely endure the Russian court, but mastered it. Yet at this stage, she remained cautious. Ambition, when revealed too early, was fatal. So she waited, and Russia, unknowingly, was preparing the ground for her rise. Catherine had arrived in Russia as a girl with no claim to power. She had endured isolation, humiliation, and danger, but she had also learned its language, its religion, its politics. She was no longer merely surviving. She was preparing. In the next chapter, her marriage would deteriorate beyond repair, and the fragile balance of the Russian throne would begin to collapse. And when it did, Catherine would be ready. Catherine's marriage was never meant to be a partnership. It was meant to be a formality. Her husband, Grand Duke Peter, was emotionally immature, politically careless, and deeply resented by the Russian court. He admired Prussia, mocked Russian traditions, and showed little interest in ruling the empire he was destined to inherit. Catherine, by contrast, did everything Peter refused to do. She learned Russian fluently. She embraced Orthodox rituals. She showed respect to nobles, guards, and servants alike. This contrast did not go unnoticed. Peter humiliated Catherine openly, surrounding himself with toys, soldiers, and drinking companions. He ignored her socially and emotionally, making it clear that he did not see her as an equal or even as a partner. For Catherine, this was not merely a personal humiliation. It was a political threat. In the Russian court, a neglected wife could be set aside without consequence. Worse still, if Peter chose another woman to produce an heir, Catherine's position would become dangerously unstable. So she endured. She learned when to remain invisible and when to be seen. Isolated within her marriage, Catherine turned inward, but not passively. She read obsessively. History, philosophy, political theory, biographies of rulers. She studied not only how states were governed, but how power was lost. She learned that rulers rarely fell because they were weak. They fell because they were careless. Catherine began to understand. Russia as a system, one held together by military loyalty, noble privilege, and fear of chaos. And she began to see Peter as a liability. He insulted the army. He alienated the nobility. He treated power as a game. Quietly, Catherine began doing the opposite. In 1754, Catherine gave birth to a son, Paul. Officially, he was Peter's child. Privately, his paternity was questioned. But none of that mattered. What mattered was this: Catherine had secured her position. Producing an heir protected her from exile and immediate danger. It gave her legitimacy in the eyes of the court and, crucially, in the eyes of Empress Elizabeth. Yet motherhood brought Catherine no warmth. Her son was taken from her almost immediately and raised by the Empress herself. Catherine was allowed little contact, reinforcing a painful lesson she had already learned. In Russia, personal bonds were secondary to power. As years passed, Catherine became a familiar and respected figure among the nobility. She listened more than she spoke. She remembered names, favors, grievances. She cultivated loyalty quietly. Unlike Peter, she understood the army's importance. She showed respect to officers, learned military traditions, and never mocked their service. This mattered, because in Russia, the throne did not rest on crowns alone, it rested on soldiers. Catherine also learned how fragile the line of succession truly was. Palace coups were not rare. Rulers rose and fell not through law, but through support, and support could be earned. Empress Elizabeth observed everything. She knew Peter was unsuitable. She knew Catherine was capable. But Elizabeth feared instability above all else. As long as she lived, she would tolerate Peter's flaws rather than risk upheaval. Catherine understood this perfectly. She did not act. She waited. She survived. And she prepared herself mentally for a future that was still uncertain, but no longer impossible. By the late 1750s, Catherine was no longer a frightened foreign bride. She was politically educated, socially connected, and quietly respected. Her marriage was hollow, her isolation complete. But isolation had sharpened her mind. Peter was moving closer to the throne and further away from the loyalty required to hold it. When Empress Elizabeth died, Russia would face a moment of dangerous transition, and Catherine would face a choice: remain silent and disappear, or act and change history. In January 1762, Empress Elizabeth died. After more than 20 years on the throne, her death marked the end of an era and the beginning of a crisis. Her nephew ascended as Emperor Peter III of Russia. From the very first days of his reign, it became clear that Peter was unprepared for power. He openly praised Frederick the Great of Prussia, Russia's recent enemy, and immediately withdrew Russian troops from the 7 Years' War, nullifying years of sacrifice and angering the army. Officers who had fought and bled felt betrayed. Peter did not attempt to hide his contempt for Russian traditions. He replaced court rituals with Prussian customs, mocked Orthodox clergy, and ignored the delicate balance of noble privilege. In a system built on loyalty and fear, Peter offered neither. Catherine watched carefully. She had waited years for this moment, not to seize power, but to understand whether Peter could hold it. The answer came quickly. Peter's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He spoke openly of divorcing Catherine. He humiliated her publicly. He elevated his mistress without discretion. More dangerously, he threatened reforms without understanding their consequences. He spoke of confiscating church lands, reorganizing the army, and punishing nobles who opposed him. Each declaration created new enemies. Meanwhile, Catherine did the opposite. She remained calm, respectful, and visibly Russian. She attended religious services, spoke the language fluently, and avoided public confrontation. The contrast was striking. To many at court, Catherine began to look like stability itself. In Russia, the army was not merely a force, it was the final authority. Peter failed to grasp this. He insulted officers. He imposed Prussian drills. He dismissed Russian military pride as backward. Catherine, by contrast, cultivated quiet relationships within elite regiments, especially the Imperial Guard. She showed respect, listened to grievances, and never promised what she could not deliver. These relationships were not romantic or impulsive, they were strategic. By mid 1762, whispers began circulating through the barracks. Russia, many believed, deserved a different ruler. Peter sensed the danger, but too late. Instead of consolidating support, he isolated himself further, retreating from court and focusing on personal interests. He underestimated Catherine, viewing her as passive and politically irrelevant. This was his greatest mistake. Catherine understood that power was rarely taken in moments of chaos. It was taken in moments of consensus. She did not rush. She waited until opposition to Peter became widespread, until acting seemed not radical but necessary. When the opportunity arrived, it came swiftly. Peter III had inherited a throne, but not the loyalty required to sit on it. He alienated the church. He angered the nobility. He betrayed the army, and in doing so, he created a vacuum. Catherine had spent years learning how Russia functioned, who mattered, who did not, and when silence was stronger than speech. The empire was ready for change, and Catherine was ready to act. In the next chapter, the waiting would end, and history would turn in a single day. The coup that placed Catherine on the Russian throne did not unfold over months. It unfolded in a single day. By the summer of 1762, opposition to Emperor Peter III had reached a breaking point. His policies had alienated nearly every powerful group in the empire: nobles, clergy, and most critically, the army. Catherine did not create this dissatisfaction. She understood it. On July 9, 1762, while Peter was away from the capital, Catherine was informed that the conspiracy against him had been exposed. Waiting was no longer an option. Action became survival. At dawn, Catherine left her residence and traveled directly to the Izmailovsky Regiment, one of the most influential units of the Imperial Guard. She appeared not as a rebel, but as a ruler. Wearing a military uniform, Catherine addressed the soldiers calmly. She spoke not of ambition, but of duty, of Russia, faith, and stability. The response was immediate. The regiment swore allegiance to her. Other guard units followed within hours. By midday, Catherine had secured control of the military forces in St. Petersburg. There was no bloodshed, no public resistance, only a swift transfer of loyalty. Catherine was taken to Kazan Cathedral, where she was publicly proclaimed Empress of Russia. This moment was unprecedented. She was not crowned through inheritance. She was not the legal heir. She was a woman claiming absolute power in a patriarchal empire. Yet the court did not resist, because Catherine offered something Peter never had: certainty. The Senate, the Synod, and the guards recognized her authority. The machinery of the state shifted almost seamlessly. Peter, isolated and confused, attempted to negotiate. It was already too late. Peter was arrested without resistance and forced to sign a document of abdication. 8 days later, he was dead. The circumstances of his death remain unclear. Officially, it was described as an accident. Privately, few believed that explanation. Catherine never publicly acknowledged responsibility. She did not need to. In Russia, power did not require innocence, it required control. At 33 years old, Catherine became Catherine II, autocrat of all the Russias. Her position was secure, but not unquestioned. She ruled without dynastic legitimacy. She ruled through force of circumstance. She ruled because Russia accepted her. But acceptance could fade. Catherine understood that seizing power was easier than keeping it. Her reign would need justification, not through fear alone, but through competence, vision, and authority. And so her real challenge began. Catherine had taken the throne without a civil war, but history would not judge her by how she seized power, only by how she used it. In the next chapter, Catherine would transform herself from an empress by necessity into a ruler by design. Catherine understood a fundamental truth of Russian rule. Seizing power was not enough. She was an empress without a crown of bloodline legitimacy. No ancient dynasty stood behind her. Her authority rested on acceptance by the army, the nobility, and the state itself. To survive, she needed to appear not as a usurper but as a natural ruler. Her first actions were deliberate and symbolic. She restored traditional court rituals abandoned by Peter. 3. She reaffirmed loyalty to the Orthodox Church. She spoke publicly of duty, stability, and service to Russia, not personal ambition. Catherine was crafting an image. Unlike Peter, Catherine understood that power in Russia was performative as well as practical. She appeared frequently in public ceremonies. She dressed as a Russian ruler, not a European imitator. She spoke calmly, confidently, and without hesitation. Most importantly, she associated herself with Peter the Great, the most revered ruler in Russian memory. By presenting herself as his ideological heir, she placed her reign within a respected historical narrative. This was not vanity, it was strategy. The Russian nobility held immense influence. Alienating them, as Peter had done, would be fatal. Catherine moved quickly to secure their loyalty. She confirmed their privileges. She rewarded supporters generously. She avoided sudden reforms that might provoke fear. At the same time, she centralized authority quietly, ensuring that loyalty flowed upward toward the throne. Catherine did not weaken the nobility. She bound them to her rule. The Russian nobility held immense influence. Alienating them, as Peter had done, would be fatal. Catherine moved quickly to secure their loyalty. She confirmed their privileges. She rewarded supporters generously. She avoided sudden reforms that might provoke fear. At the same time, she centralized authority quietly, ensuring that loyalty flowed upward toward the throne. Catherine did not weaken the nobility. She bound them to her rule. Catherine presented herself as an enlightened monarch. She corresponded with European philosophers. She spoke of reason, law, and education. She positioned herself as a ruler guided by intellect rather than superstition. But beneath the language of enlightenment lay absolute authority. Catherine believed deeply in autocracy. She did not intend to share power. Reform, in her view, must strengthen the state, not limit it. This contradiction would define her reign. One question loomed over Catherine's early rule: succession. Her son, Paul, was the legal heir, but Catherine distrusted him deeply. She considered him unstable and feared that his rule would undo everything she had built. Publicly, she supported his position. Privately, she kept him distant from power. Catherine ruled not as a regent, but as a sovereign, and Russia accepted it. By the end of her first year as empress, Catherine had done what few believed possible. She had stabilized the throne. She had unified the elite. She had created the image of a legitimate ruler. But ruling Russia meant more than appearances. The empire was vast, diverse, and restless. In the next chapter, Catherine would attempt something no ruler had fully achieved before: reforming Russia without destroying it. Catherine believed that reason could strengthen autocracy. She admired the ideas of the European Enlightenment: order, rational law, education, and progress. But she did not believe these ideas belonged to the people. They belonged to the ruler. Soon after ascending the throne, Catherine set out to modernize Russia's legal system, which remained fragmented, outdated, and deeply unjust. Her solution was ambitious. In 1767, Catherine issued the nakaz, or instruction, a document outlining her vision for law and governance. It drew heavily from Enlightenment thinkers such as Montesquieu and Beccaria. It spoke against torture, promoted equality before the law, and argued that punishment should serve justice, not cruelty. Across Europe, the nakaz was celebrated. Philosophers praised Catherine as a model of enlightened monarchy. She became known not merely as a ruler, but as a thinker. But within Russia, reality was more complex. Catherine convened a legislative commission, bringing together representatives from across the empire to reform the legal code. In theory, it was revolutionary. In practice, it revealed Russia's fractures. Nobles, townspeople, and regional elites brought competing demands. Serfs, millions of them, were excluded entirely. Debate replaced progress. Ideals collided with privilege. After 2 years, the commission was quietly dissolved. No new legal code emerged. Catherine learned a critical lesson. Reform threatened stability. Any attempt to weaken noble privilege risked rebellion. Any challenge to serfdom risked economic collapse and unrest. So Catherine adapted. She continued to speak the language of enlightenment, but ruled with caution. Ideas would inspire policy. They would not control it. Where law failed, Catherine turned to education. She expanded schools, founded institutes for women, and promoted literacy among elites. Education, she believed, would produce loyal administrators, not political challengers. Knowledge, in Catherine's Russia, was not liberation. It was organization. Catherine had dreamed of reshaping Russia through law and reason. Instead, she learned that the empire resisted transformation. The Enlightenment could decorate her rule, but not define it. And as Catherine turned outward, toward expansion and power, Russia would grow larger, stronger, and more dangerous. Catherine understood that power within Russia depended on strength beyond its borders. An empire that did not expand risked appearing weak, and weakness, in 18th century geopolitics, invited destruction. Under Catherine's rule, Russia would grow into one of the dominant powers of Europe. The greatest external challenge came from the Ottoman Empire. Russia had long sought access to warm water, ports, and greater influence over the Black Sea. Catherine saw this not only as strategic necessity, but as historical destiny. War broke out in 1768. Russian forces, better organized and increasingly professional, achieved decisive victories. The navy triumphed in the Mediterranean. The army advanced southward, breaking Ottoman resistance. In 1774, the war ended with the Treaty of Kuchuk-Kainarcha. It was a triumph. Russia gained territory, influence over Crimea, and the right to protect Orthodox Christians within Ottoman lands, a powerful political tool. In 1783, Crimea was formally annexed by Russia. This moment marked a turning point. Russia now dominated the northern Black Sea. Its geopolitical position was transformed. Catherine had achieved what generations of rulers had failed to secure. Her popularity soared. To the army, she was a victorious commander. To the nobility, a protector of national greatness. To Europe, a monarch to be taken seriously. Catherine's ambitions extended westward. Poland, weakened by internal divisions, became a battleground for influence among Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Through a series of partitions, Poland was gradually erased from the map. Catherine justified this not as conquest, but as stabilization. In reality, it was imperial expansion at its most calculated. Expansion brought glory, but also consequences. War demanded resources. Territory demanded control. Diversity demanded force. As the empire grew, so did its tensions. And beneath the image of a victorious ruler, unrest simmered. Catherine had made Russia larger, stronger, and feared. But empires are not held together by borders alone. Inside Russia, millions remained oppressed, voiceless, and restless. And soon, that unrest would explode into the most dangerous rebellion of Catherine's reign. Catherine ruled an empire of contradictions. She spoke the language of enlightenment, reason, and progress, yet presided over a system built on serfdom, one of the harshest forms of human bondage in Europe. Millions of peasants were bound to land they did not own, subject to the authority of landlords with near absolute power. Catherine knew the system was unjust, but she also knew it was foundational. Rather than weakening serfdom, Catherine strengthened it. She expanded noble control over peasants. She allowed landowners greater legal authority. She extended serfdom into newly conquered territories. These decisions were not ideological, they were strategic. The nobility formed the backbone of Catherine's rule. Undermining them would risk revolt among those who kept her on the throne. The cost of stability was suffering. In 1773, that suffering ignited. A former Cossack officer named Yemelyan Pugachev claimed to be the murdered. Emperor Peter III returned to reclaim the throne. The claim was absurd, but belief mattered more than truth. Peasants, serfs, and marginalized groups rallied to him, not out of loyalty to Peter, but out of desperation. The rebellion spread rapidly across the Volga region, fueled by promises of freedom, land, and revenge against landlords. For the first time in her reign, Catherine faced a threat from below. The rebellion shocked the empire. Estates were burned, nobles were killed, order collapsed in entire regions. Catherine responded with force. The army crushed the uprising systematically and without mercy. Pugachev was captured, executed, and publicly displayed as a warning. The message was unmistakable. Rebellion would not be tolerated. The rebellion left Catherine changed. She abandoned any remaining illusions about reforming serfdom. Stability, she concluded, required control, not compassion. Censorship increased, surveillance expanded, authority tightened. The Enlightenment rhetoric remained, but its limits were now clear. The Pugachev rebellion revealed the fragility beneath Russia's imperial surface. Catherine had preserved order, but at the cost of brutality. She emerged more powerful, but also more cautious. And as internal reform retreated, Catherine turned once more to culture, legacy, and image. After rebellion and war, Catherine turned to something more enduring than force. She turned to legacy. Catherine understood that rulers could be feared in their lifetime, but remembered only through what they left behind. Culture, art, and knowledge could shape memory in ways armies never could. She intended not merely to rule Russia, but to define it. Catherine corresponded with the leading intellectuals of Europe, Voltaire, Diderot, and other Enlightenment figures who praised her as a philosopher on the throne. Their admiration served a purpose. Through them, Catherine positioned Russia as a civilized European power, no longer distant or barbaric, but intellectually engaged and culturally refined. She welcomed ideas, carefully filtered. Philosophy was encouraged. Political dissent was not. Catherine invested heavily in the arts. She expanded theaters, supported writers, and commissioned grand architectural projects that reshaped St. Petersburg into an imperial capital worthy of Europe's great cities. Most famously, she founded what would become the Hermitage Museum, acquiring vast collections of European art. Paintings, sculptures, and manuscripts flowed into Russia not merely as decoration, but as symbols of imperial sophistication. Culture became propaganda. Catherine supported education for women within limits. She founded institutes for noble girls, promoting literacy, discipline, and moral instruction. Educated women, she believed, would raise enlightened sons and maintain social order. Education was not meant to challenge hierarchy. It was meant to reinforce it. Catherine wrote her own memoirs and encouraged favorable accounts of her reign. She understood that history was not neutral, it was written. Portraits depicted her as calm, authoritative, almost timeless. She cultivated the image of a rational ruler above passion, chaos, and excess, even as her private life told a more complex story. Catherine had built an image that stretched beyond Russia's borders. She was admired, discussed, and remembered. But behind the legend stood a woman who ruled alone, surrounded by power, yet deeply aware of its fragility. In the next chapter, we turn to the private sphere Catherine could never fully control: love, desire, and court politics. Catherine's private life was never truly private. As a woman ruling an absolute monarchy, her relationships were scrutinized, exaggerated, and weaponized by both allies and enemies. What was forgiven or even celebrated in male rulers became controversy when practiced by a woman. Yet Catherine refused to apologize for desire. Catherine took lovers throughout her reign, but rarely without calculation. These relationships were not simply emotional, they were political, offering companionship, loyalty, and stability within a court filled with intrigue. Unlike Peter, Catherine did not allow personal relationships to undermine her authority. Her lovers rose through favor but never ruled through her. When relationships ended, they ended cleanly. Titles and estates were granted, then distance restored. Power remained with the empress. Among her earliest and most important lovers was Grigory Orlov, a charismatic officer who had supported her during the coup. Orlov was brave, influential, and popular within the military. For a time, Catherine considered marriage. But marriage meant sharing power, and Catherine would not do that again. Their relationship eventually ended, but Orlov remained respected and rewarded. The most significant figure in Catherine's personal and political life was Grigory Potemkin. Their relationship defied easy categorization: lover, advisor, partner, and architect of empire. Potemkin played a central role in southern expansion, particularly in Crimea. He organized settlements, oversaw military strategy, and helped shape Russia's imperial vision. Even after their romantic relationship ended, their partnership endured. This was not weakness, it was trust. Rumors about Catherine's sexuality flourished. Many were exaggerated, some were fabricated, all were fueled by misogyny. Her enemies sought to undermine her legitimacy by portraying her as immoral or excessive. Catherine ignored them. She understood that reputation could be shaped, but not controlled. Results mattered more. Catherine ruled as both a woman and a sovereign, refusing to choose between them. Her personal life challenged expectations, but her authority remained intact. Yet time was passing, and the question of succession, long postponed, was becoming unavoidable. For most of her reign, Catherine avoided one subject above all others: succession. Her son Paul was the legal heir to the Russian throne, but Catherine did not trust him with power, with stability, or with the future of the empire she had built. Paul had grown up distant from his mother, raised under strict supervision and shaped by resentment. He was emotional, suspicious, and deeply aware that his position depended entirely on Catherine's will. This tension never softened. Catherine limited Paul's role in governance. He was given titles, estates, and ceremonial duties, but never real authority. Publicly, she treated him with formal respect. Privately, she feared his temperament. She believed Paul lacked restraint and judgment. More dangerously, she believed he was obsessed with reversing her policies. To Catherine, Paul represented not continuity, but collapse. Catherine increasingly considered bypassing her son. She favored her grandson, Alexander, whom she helped educate personally. Alexander was intelligent, composed, and receptive to Enlightenment ideas. Some believed Catherine intended to name Alexander as her successor, but doing so would provoke crisis. Russian tradition, though fragile, still valued dynastic order. Disinheriting Paul could invite rebellion or civil war, so Catherine delayed. As Catherine aged, her control remained firm, but her energy diminished. Europe was changing. The French Revolution had shattered monarchies and spread fear among rulers. Catherine, once celebrated as an enlightened monarch, now condemned revolutionary ideas as dangerous chaos. Order had become her highest value. Catherine had ruled Russia for more than 3 decades. She had expanded its borders. She had strengthened its institutions. She had shaped its image. But the question she could not resolve remained: what would happen after her? In the next chapter, Catherine's final years reveal a ruler confronting mortality and the limits of power. In her final years, Catherine ruled as she always had, with discipline, routine, and control. Age slowed her body, but not her authority. She continued to rise early, read reports, and dictate policy with precision. The court remained orderly, efficient, and deferential. Yet time was no longer an abstract concept, it was personal. The French Revolution had altered Europe forever. Kings were executed, thrones were overturned. Ideas Catherine once admired, liberty, equality, popular sovereignty, now appeared dangerous and uncontrollable. She responded not with reform, but with repression. Censorship tightened. Radical thinkers were silenced. Russia would not become France. Catherine no longer believed in transformation. She believed in survival. Despite her strength, Catherine avoided formal decisions about succession. She continued to keep Paul distant. She continued to favor Alexander quietly, but no official decree was issued. This indecision would shape Russia's future. On November 17, 1796, Catherine suffered a sudden stroke. She never regained consciousness. At 67 years old, Catherine II of Russia was dead. Her reign had lasted 34 years, longer than any woman in Russian history. Power passed swiftly to Paul. There was no struggle, no resistance. The system Catherine built functioned exactly as she designed it. Paul ordered immediate changes, reversing many of her policies and reshaping the court to reflect his resentments. Catherine's control ended where life did. Catherine had ruled absolutely, but death reminded Russia of a truth no monarch could escape. Power is temporary. Legacy is not. In the final chapter, we examine how Catherine the Great is remembered and whether greatness can truly be measured. History remembers Catherine as the Great. Few rulers receive that title. Fewer still earn it without inheritance, without tradition, and without forgiveness from history. Catherine ruled Russia for 34 years, long enough to reshape its borders, institutions, and identity. Under her reign, Russia became a European power to be reckoned with. Its armies were feared, its culture admired, its voice influential. Measured by empire, Catherine succeeded. But greatness is never simple. Catherine spoke the language of enlightenment while ruling through autocracy. She condemned cruelty while strengthening serfdom. She encouraged reason while silencing dissent. These were not accidents. They were choices. Catherine believed that Russia could not survive idealism. It required control. In her view, order was more valuable than freedom and stability more important than justice. To many, this makes her a hypocrite. To others, a realist. Catherine's gender shaped her legacy as much as her policies. She ruled in a world that doubted women's authority. Every decision was scrutinized, every relationship politicized, every mistake magnified. That she ruled as long and as firmly as she did remains remarkable. She did not soften power. She mastered it. Catherine left Russia larger, stronger, and more centralized, but also more unequal. Her successors inherited both strength and tension. The questions she postponed about serfdom, reform, and succession would eventually return, with consequences she never lived to see. Was Catherine enlightened? Partially. Was she ruthless? Undeniably. Was she great? That depends on how greatness is defined. If greatness means expansion, control, and endurance, then yes. If it means justice, equality, and freedom, then the answer is less certain. Catherine once wrote that power was never given. It was taken, held, and defended. She lived by those words. Her reign was not a moral lesson, it was a political one. In the frozen heart of an empire, a foreign woman became an absolute ruler and ruled without apology. That is why history remembers her, not because she was perfect, but because she was powerful,